A cleaning lady approached a millionaire and told him that his wife was planning something evil. The next morning, there was a luxury car near her humble home. Emily wiped her brow, her fingers trembling slightly as she gripped the rag tighter. The scent of bleach lingered in the air, mixing with the faint perfume of luxury that seemed to be soaked into every corner of the hotel room. She'd been working here for over 2 years, cleaning rooms that belonged to people who probably didn't even know she existed. They walked past her as if she were invisible, as if she were part of the background, like the marble floors or the crystal chandeliers hanging in the lobby. That day started like any other. Emily had entered the suite of James Wilson, the well-known billionaire, with her usual routine in mind: dust, vacuum, and be out of the room before anyone even noticed she'd been there. James was one of those men she had never really seen up close. He was always coming and going, surrounded by assistants, rarely spending more than a few minutes in his room. But that day was different. As she dusted the nightstand, something caught her attention. Voices, hushed but sharp, echoed from the adjoining room. Emily froze, rag still in hand. It wasn't uncommon to hear conversations between guests, but something about this one felt off. She couldn't help but lean closer to the door. The voice on the other side, a woman's, was familiar. Amanda, James Wilson's wife, whom she had seen in passing on several occasions. Emily could hear Amanda's voice, but it wasn't the loving tone one might expect from a wife. "He'll never see it coming," Amanda whispered, her words dripping with malice. Emily's heart skipped a beat. "We'll make sure the trip is the last one he ever takes," a man responded, his voice low and cold. Emily didn't recognize the man, but the tension in the air was unmistakable. It wasn't just a casual conversation. This was a plan to kill. Her pulse quickened. She was suddenly very aware of her surroundings: the quiet hum of the air conditioner, the muffled noise from the hallway, and the pounding of her own heartbeat in her ears. Every part of her body screamed to leave, to pretend she hadn't heard anything, to go back to her life of scrubbing floors and changing sheets without getting involved. But her feet wouldn't move. "Ryan, we need to be careful. One slip-up, and everything's ruined." Amanda's voice cut through the air again, colder this time. "Ryan." Emily didn't know much about Amanda, but she definitely knew Amanda wasn't married to anyone named Ryan. This was more than a murder plot. This was betrayal at its core. The weight of what she had just heard settled in her chest like a stone. Amanda and her lover were planning to kill James Wilson during his next business trip, and no one knew. Emily backed away from the door, her breath coming in shallow gasps. What was she supposed to do? Call the police? Tell someone? But who would believe her? She was a maid, just the help. People like Amanda didn't even notice people like her. And even if they did believe her, Amanda and this Ryan character might come after her. They obviously had no problem with murder. Before she knew it, Emily was standing in the middle of the suite, staring at her reflection in the spotless mirror. She felt small, insignificant. But that smallness came with a kind of safety. They didn't know she had heard. They didn't know who she was. She could disappear into the background like she always did. She could walk out of that room and pretend nothing had ever happened. Her fingers trembled as she finished dusting the room, her movements automatic, though her mind raced in 1,000 different directions. Maybe James wasn't a good man. Most of the wealthy people she cleaned for weren't. But did that mean he deserved to die? Did it mean she should stay silent? By the time she left the suite, her mind was made up. She couldn't just stand by and let someone be killed, no matter what. She had to do something. Later that evening, Emily sat in the employee lounge, staring at the cheap coffee in front of her. She barely tasted it as she replayed the conversation in her mind over and over again. What if Amanda had seen her? What if Ryan knew someone had been in the room? She shuddered at the thought. She had to be smart about this. If she went to James directly, he might not believe her. Or worse, Amanda might find out she was involved. But Emily wasn't a coward. She didn't have much, but she had her conscience. She couldn't let someone die just because she was scared. She just needed to find a way to warn him without giving away too much. The next morning, James Wilson arrived at the hotel lobby. Emily spotted him from across the room, his presence as imposing as ever, surrounded by his usual entourage. Her heart raced as she made her way toward him, rehearsing what she would say in her mind. She had one shot at this. When she finally reached him, she cleared her throat, her voice shaky but determined. "Mr. Wilson," she called out, surprising even herself. He turned, his eyes narrowing as he took her in. "I need to tell you something. About your trip. You shouldn't go. Something's not right." James raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. He glanced at her name tag, his expression unreadable. "And why should I trust you?" Emily swallowed hard, unsure how to respond. But she knew one thing. Whether he believed her or not, she had done what she could. She had warned him. James Wilson stood there for a moment, his eyes narrowing at Emily as if trying to decipher some hidden meaning in her words. The lobby of the hotel buzzed around them with the usual hum of morning activity. Guests checking in, bellhops wheeling carts of luggage, business people rushing out the doors. But for Emily, it felt like the world had come to a stop. Her breath caught in her throat as she waited for his response. "I don't know what you think you know," James finally said, his voice low but firm. "But I don't make decisions based on vague warnings from strangers." Emily felt a pang of panic rise in her chest. He wasn't going to believe her. Why would he? She was just the maid, someone who blended into the background. Who was she to tell a man like him what to do with his life? But she couldn't give up now. "Please," she whispered, leaning in a little closer to avoid anyone overhearing. "I can't explain everything. Just trust me on this. Don't go on that trip." For a moment, something flickered in James's eyes. Was it doubt? Curiosity? She couldn't tell. He straightened up, giving her one last look before he turned to leave. "I'll think about it," he said over his shoulder, his voice clipped, dismissive. And just like that, he was gone. Emily stood frozen, watching him disappear into the crowd. That was it. She had done everything she could. Now, it was up to him. Her heart pounded as she made her way back to the staff quarters, her mind swirling with fear and uncertainty. What if he didn't take her seriously? What if Amanda and Ryan went through with their plan? The weight of what she had overheard felt heavier than ever. The rest of her shift passed in a blur. She moved through the motions of cleaning, but her mind was elsewhere, replaying the conversation with James, wondering what his next move would be. Was he the type to take such a warning seriously? Or would he brush it off, like so many other wealthy guests would? That evening, as Emily made her way home through the bustling streets of New York, she couldn't shake the feeling of dread. The city was alive around her, honking cabs, street vendors calling out, tourists snapping pictures. But all she could think about was what she'd heard in that suite. The air felt heavier, almost suffocating, and she wondered if Amanda and Ryan had already noticed something was wrong. When she finally arrived at her small apartment, the silence was almost too much to bear. She paced the narrow hallway, her thoughts spiraling. What if they found out it was her? What if Amanda had noticed something and figured out she had overheard? Emily tried to push the thoughts away, but sleep didn't come easily that night. The next morning, as she stepped out of her building, she froze in her tracks. Parked right outside was a sleek black car, far too expensive for her modest neighborhood. It gleamed under the morning sun, an out-of-place beacon of wealth in the midst of the old brick buildings and cracked sidewalks. Emily's stomach twisted. Who would be driving such a car here? And more importantly, who were they waiting for? She hesitated, considering turning back inside, but then she saw him, the driver. Dressed in a sharp black suit, he stepped out of the car, adjusting his hat before locking eyes with her. Her heart skipped a beat as he walked toward her, and for a moment, every nerve in her body screamed to run, but she didn't move. "Miss Emily?" the man asked, his voice calm and measured. She nodded, unable to find her voice. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a crisp white envelope, offering it to her. "This is for you." Her hand shook as she took the envelope, her eyes darting between the man and the car. Who sent this?" she finally managed to ask, her voice barely above a whisper. The driver smiled faintly, tipping his hat. "Mr. Wilson," he said simply. "He wanted to make sure you got it." James. Relief flooded through her, though it was quickly followed by confusion. What was this? She glanced down at the envelope, the paper thick and expensive, her name written in elegant script. Without another word, the driver turned and walked back to the car, leaving her standing there with her heart racing. Back in her apartment, Emily sat at the small kitchen table, staring at the envelope as if it might bite her. After a moment, she slid her finger under the seal and opened it carefully. Inside was a single note, written in the same neat handwriting. "Thank you for your concern. I've decided to cancel the trip. Enclosed is something I believe you'll find useful." Emily's hands trembled as she pulled out a second item from the envelope. A key. It was small and plain, attached to a silver keychain with a simple engraving, Wilshire Towers. Her brow furrowed as she stared at it. Wilshire Towers was an upscale apartment building downtown, a place far beyond anything she could afford. Why was he sending her this? Her phone buzzed, pulling her out of her thoughts. A message from an unknown number flashed across the screen. "Your new place is ready. Welcome to a fresh start. J.W." Emily blinked at the message, her mind struggling to keep up. A fresh start. Was this real? Why would he do this for her? She had expected a simple thank you, maybe nothing at all. But an apartment? Her life had never been anything but modest, barely scraping by in her cramped little unit, and now James Wilson, a man she barely knew, was offering her a new life. She stood up, pacing the room. This didn't feel right. There had to be more to this. Why would a billionaire care about what a maid had to say? Why had he believed her warning? And why go to such lengths to thank her? As these thoughts spun in her mind, she realized that her life had just taken a turn she never could have predicted. She wasn't sure what lay ahead, but she knew one thing for certain. Nothing would ever be the same. The sun was just beginning to set as Emily made her way toward Wilshire Towers. The key sat heavy in her pocket, an ever-present reminder of the strange turn her life had taken. Her footsteps felt unsure, hesitant. This didn't feel real. Even as the towering building loomed closer, its glass facade reflecting the fading light of the city, she still couldn't wrap her mind around it. Why would James Wilson, one of the richest men in the world, go out of his way to offer her a new place to live? It felt wrong, like there was some unspoken condition that she hadn't yet uncovered. But the note had been clear. A fresh start. Those words echoed in her mind as she approached the entrance of the building, her heart racing in her chest. The doorman greeted her with a polite nod, as if people like her walked through these doors every day. It was surreal. She had cleaned enough fancy places to know how out of place she was here. But still, she handed him the key and watched as he typed something into the security system. "Ms. Emily, right. You're all set. Elevator to your right. Take it to the 15th floor," the doorman said with a practiced smile. Emily mumbled her thanks, stepping into the elevator, the door closing with a soft whoosh. The ride up felt like forever, even though it couldn't have been more than a minute. Her pulse quickened with each passing floor. By the time the doors opened, she felt like she was in a dream. Stepping out into the hallway, she found herself in front of apartment 1504. The key turned easily in the lock, and as she pushed the door open, Emily's breath caught in her throat. The apartment was beautiful, far more luxurious than anything she could have imagined. Hardwood floors gleamed under the recessed lighting, and floor-to-ceiling windows offered a sweeping view of the New York skyline. Everything was immaculate, from the modern furniture to the sleek kitchen appliances she had only ever seen in catalogs. She wandered through the space in a daze, fingers brushing over the smooth surfaces of the counters, the soft fabric of the couch. It didn't feel real. How could this be her life now? Just a few days ago, she was scrubbing floors, worrying about making rent. And now she was standing in a place like this. The thought made her stop in her tracks, a sudden wave of uncertainty crashing over her. This didn't make sense. Nothing about this situation made sense. Why had James done this out of gratitude? But this was too much, far too much for a simple warning. Emily found herself sinking into one of the chairs, her head in her hands. She had done the right thing, hadn't she? Warning James had been the only choice she could live with. But now, with the weight of this new apartment pressing down on her, she couldn't shake the feeling that something else was going on. What had she gotten herself into? A knock at the door startled her, pulling her out of her thoughts. Her heart skipped a beat as she stood, crossing the room to answer it. When she opened the door, she found a young man standing there, holding a clipboard. He was dressed in a black suit, professional but casual, and smiled warmly when he saw her. "Miss Emily, I presume?" he asked, glancing at the clipboard. "Yes, that's me," she replied cautiously. "Good evening. I'm Evan, Mr. Wilson's assistant," he said, extending a hand. Emily shook it hesitantly. "I've been instructed to give you a quick tour of the building, show you the amenities, and make sure you're all settled in." Emily blinked, her mind struggling to keep up. "A tour?" Evan nodded, his smile unwavering. "Yes, Mr. Wilson wants to ensure you're comfortable. He's very particular about his guests." Guests. The word stuck in her mind. That's what she was to James, just a guest in this fancy new world he lived in. She wasn't sure if that made her feel better or worse. But as Evan led her through the building, showing her the gym, the pool, the private lounge areas, all Emily could think about was how out of place she felt in this world of wealth and privilege. By the time they returned to the apartment, her head was spinning. Evan handed her a small card with his contact information and a polite goodbye before leaving her alone once more. The silence of the apartment was overwhelming. Emily sat down on the edge of the plush bed, staring at the city lights through the window. What was she supposed to do now? Was this really her life? And what did James expect in return? Her thoughts spiraled again, but she was too exhausted to keep worrying. Eventually, she crawled under the covers, the soft sheets a stark contrast to the scratchy ones she was used to. Sleep came quickly, but it was restless, filled with fragmented dreams of danger and whispered threats. The next morning, Emily woke to the sound of her phone buzzing on the nightstand. She reached for it groggily, blinking at the unfamiliar number on the screen. Her thumb hovered over the answer button, her pulse quickening. "Hello?" she answered, her voice still thick with sleep. "Miss Emily?" The voice on the other end was brisk, efficient. "This is Detective Martinez with the NYPD. I need to ask you a few questions regarding Mr. James Wilson." Emily's blood ran cold. What had happened? Why was a detective calling her? She sat up quickly, her mind racing. "What is this about?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. The detective's voice didn't waver. "There's been some developments. I understand you've been in contact with Mr. Wilson recently, and we'd like to speak with you in person. Could you come down to the station today?" Emily's heart pounded in her chest. Her mind instantly flashed back to the conversation she overheard. Amanda's voice whispering those chilling words about the trip. Was this about that? Was James okay? I can come in," she stammered, her throat dry. "Is Mr. Wilson all right?" There was a pause on the other end, just long enough to send a fresh wave of panic through her. "I'll explain everything when you get here, Ms. Emily," the detective said, and then the line went dead. Emily sat there for a moment, staring at the phone in her hand, Her stomach twisted in knots. What had happened to James? Was this about the murder plot? Did Amanda and Ryan know that she had warned him? With trembling hands, Emily got dressed, her mind spinning with questions and fear. As she made her way out of the building, the weight of the key in her pocket felt heavier than ever. Whatever was happening, it was far from over. The city streets felt different as Emily walked toward the police station, her mind swimming in a mix of fear and confusion. The typical sounds of New York, the honking horns, the distant chatter, the constant hum of life, felt muffled, as though the world had shifted without her noticing. She kept replaying the detective's voice in her mind. Something had happened to James Wilson. Something serious enough to involve the police. As she entered the station, the fluorescent lights above buzzed quietly, casting a sterile glow over the bustling room. The air was thick with the scent of burnt coffee and paperwork. She had never been in a police station before, not even as a visitor, and now her heart raced in her chest as she approached the front desk. "Can I help you?" asked the officer at the desk, looking up with mild disinterest. I'm here to see Detective Martinez," Emily said, her voice steadier than she felt. The officer gave a quick nod, gesturing toward a set of double doors. "Go through there. Second office on the right." Emily's legs felt like lead as she made her way through the doors, the weight of everything pressing down on her. What if Amanda had found out she was the one who warned James? What if Ryan was involved? The possibilities churned in her mind, each one worse than the last. She knocked lightly on the door, her hand trembling just enough for her to notice. After a brief moment, a man in his late 40s opened the door. His expression was serious but not unkind. He was dressed in a plain suit, the kind of professional uniform that didn't say much about the man wearing it. "Miss Emily?" he asked, motioning for her to come in. "I'm Detective Martinez." Emily nodded, stepping inside. The office was small, cramped with files stacked on every available surface, but Martinez gestured to a chair across from his desk, and she sat down, her hands clenching the strap of her purse in her lap. "Thank you for coming in," he said, settling behind the desk and pulling out a folder. He flipped through a few pages before finally looking up at her. "I'm going to get right to it. Mr. Wilson canceled a trip recently. From what I understand, you advised him to do so." Emily swallowed hard. She knew this was coming, but hearing it out loud made her stomach twist. "Yes," she admitted. "I overheard something, and I thought it was dangerous for him to go." Martinez's eyes narrowed slightly, his attention focused entirely on her. "Can you explain exactly what you overheard?" Taking a deep breath, Emily recounted the conversation she had overheard between Amanda and Ryan in the hotel room. She left nothing out, describing their voices, the way Amanda had spoken about making sure the trip would be James's last. As she spoke, she could feel her heart pounding harder, the tension growing with each word. Martinez listened without interrupting, his face unreadable as he scribbled notes on a pad in front of him. When she finished, he sat back, considering her carefully. "Mr. Wilson canceled the trip, which seems to have saved his life," Martinez said slowly. "But there's more to the story. We believe Mr. Wilson has been investigating his wife for some time now, and what you overheard may just be the tip of the iceberg." Emily blinked, her mind racing. Investigating her? For what? Martinez's expression hardened slightly. Financial fraud, infidelity, and now, it seems, attempted murder. Mr. Wilson's been gathering evidence, but it wasn't until he received your warning that he realized just how serious the situation was. He's been working closely with us ever since. The weight of Martinez's words settled over her like a blanket. James had known. He had known something was wrong all along. And now, with her warning, it had all come to light. Emily felt a strange mix of relief and dread. On one hand, she had done the right thing. On the other, she was now more entangled in this dangerous situation than she had ever wanted to be. Is he safe?" Emily asked, her voice quieter now. Martinez hesitated before answering. "For now, yes, we've placed him under protective custody while we gather more evidence, but we need to tread carefully. Amanda Wilson is not the kind of woman who will go down without a fight, and her lover, Ryan, is just as dangerous. Emily nodded, her hands still clutching her purse. She had always known that the world of the wealthy was different from hers. But this, murder, fraud, betrayal, this was something else entirely. And yet, somehow, she had become a part of it. "I understand," she said, though her mind was still spinning with everything she had just learned. Martinez studied her for a moment longer, then leaned forward, his tone softening slightly. "I know this is a lot to take in, and I'm sure you're scared, but you did the right thing by coming forward. Mr. Wilson owes you his life." His words should have made her feel better, but they didn't. If anything, they only reminded her of how fragile everything had become. If Amanda and Ryan were willing to kill James, what would they do to her if they found out she had been the one to warn him? Before she could say anything more, Martinez stood up, signaling the end of their conversation. "We're going to keep an eye on things," he assured her. "But I'll ask you to stay in touch. If you notice anything suspicious, if anyone contacts you, anything at all, you call me immediately. We can't afford to take any chances." Emily nodded, rising to her feet. Her legs felt unsteady, like she was walking on air. She left the station in a daze, her mind buzzing with everything Martinez had told her. Protective custody, financial fraud, betrayal. It all felt too big, too dangerous. The walk back to her apartment felt like a blur. By the time she stepped inside, her body felt like it was running on autopilot. She locked the door behind her and leaned against it, trying to calm the racing thoughts in her head. She had done the right thing, Martinez had said, but at what cost? Her phone buzzed again, snapping her out of her thoughts. She pulled it from her pocket, her breath catching when she saw the number. It wasn't one she recognized, but something about it sent a chill down her spine. With shaking hands, she answered, "Hello?" A long pause, followed by the sound of soft breathing on the other end. And then, finally, a voice she recognized all too well. "Emily?" Amanda's voice purred through the line, sending a shiver down Emily's spine. "We need to talk." Emily's stomach twisted, her hand gripping the phone so tightly her knuckles turned white. How had Amanda gotten her number? What did she want? "You think you're clever, don't you?" Amanda continued, her voice icy now. "But you've made a big mistake. People like you don't mess with people like me and get away with it. I'll make sure of that." The line went dead before Emily could respond, but the threat hung in the air like a dark cloud. Emily dropped the phone onto the counter, her heart pounding in her chest. She had known this was coming, but the reality of it was much worse than she had anticipated. Amanda knew, and she wasn't going to let Emily get away with it. Emily's hands shook as she stared down at her phone, the dial tone still humming in her ears long after Amanda had hung up. Her mind raced, heart pounding so loudly she could feel it in her throat. The threat Amanda had made wasn't just empty words. It felt like a promise, cold and terrifying. What was she going to do? Emily paced her apartment, the feeling of being trapped slowly sinking in. The bright, luxurious space that had seemed like an impossible dream just days before now felt suffocating. Every shadow seemed darker. Every noise from the hallway made her jump. She couldn't escape the feeling that Amanda or Ryan could be out there, waiting, watching. She wanted to call Detective Martinez, tell him about Amanda's phone call. But what could they really do? The police couldn't guard her every second of the day, and she wasn't about to run and hide. Not yet. Not until she figured out what this all meant, and what her role in this twisted mess had become. In the midst of her spiraling thoughts, a sharp knock on the door jolted her back to reality. Emily's breath caught in her throat. She wasn't expecting anyone. Was it Amanda? Had she come for her already? She hesitated, her hand hovering near the doorknob. After a long, tense moment, she finally peeked through the peephole. To her surprise, it wasn't Amanda or Ryan. It was James. Her heart leapt into her throat. She hadn't seen him since their brief encounter at the hotel, and now, here he was, standing at her door, looking disheveled and tense. Without thinking, she quickly unlocked the door and pulled it open. "James," she breathed, her voice laced with both relief and confusion. "What are you doing here?" James stepped inside, his eyes scanning the apartment before settling on her. He looked different from the polished, composed businessman she had seen from afar all those times at the hotel. His hair was slightly messy, his suit rumpled, and there was an intensity in his gaze that made her heart race. "I needed to talk to you," he said, his voice low and urgent. "There's more to this than you know, Emily. Much more." Emily's mind spun. More. What could be more than an attempted murder and a web of lies? She closed the door behind him, bracing herself for whatever bombshell he was about to drop. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. What else could there be? James ran a hand through his hair, pacing the small space of the living room. "After you warned me about Amanda and Ryan, I started digging deeper. I knew something was wrong, but I didn't realize just how far back this goes." He stopped, turning to face her. "It's about your father." Emily's world stopped spinning. Her father? She hadn't thought about him in years. He had died when she was young, leaving her and her mother to struggle on their own. But what could her father possibly have to do with any of this? "My father," Emily echoed, her voice trembling. "What does he have to do with any of this?" James sighed, his expression softening for the first time since he'd arrived. "I didn't realize it until recently, but your father and I were close friends when we were kids. We grew up together. He was like a brother to me." Emily's knees nearly gave out. Her father had never mentioned James. He'd never spoken about any old friends or connections from his past. It had always been just the two of them, scraping by, surviving day by day. This didn't make sense. "I don't understand," Emily said, her voice shaking. "My father died in an accident years ago. What does that have to do with Amanda and Ryan?" James stepped closer, his expression filled with a mix of guilt and determination. "That accident wasn't an accident, Emily. Your father was involved in something much bigger, something dangerous, and I think Amanda had something to do with it." Emily's legs felt weak, and she sank into the nearest chair, her mind reeling. Her father's death wasn't an accident. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she tried to process everything James was telling her. She had always believed her father's death was a tragic, random event, but now, James was telling her it was connected to this web of deceit, murder, and betrayal. "I don't know all the details yet," James continued, his voice softer now. "But I found enough to know that your father was framed for something he didn't do. He got caught up in something with Amanda's family years ago, something that cost him his life. And now, it's all coming back." Emily's head spun. Her father, framed, murdered. And now Amanda, the woman she had overheard plotting to kill James, was somehow connected to her father's death. The world around her seemed to blur as the weight of it all crashed down on her. "Why didn't you tell me this sooner?" she asked, her voice barely audible. James's eyes darkened. "I wasn't sure. I needed more proof. And honestly, I didn't want to drag you into this unless I had to. But now, with Amanda threatening you, I can't keep it from you any longer. You deserve to know the truth." Emily's mind raced, trying to piece together everything. Her father had been connected to James's world in ways she never imagined. And now, she was caught in the middle of a decades-old conspiracy, one that had claimed her father's life and now threatened hers. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice small but steady. "How do we stop her?" James's gaze hardened. "We gather evidence. We expose her for everything she's done. But it's going to take time, and it's going to be dangerous. Amanda's not just playing games anymore. She's ruthless, and now that she knows you're involved..." He didn't have to finish the sentence for Emily to understand the gravity of the situation. Amanda was coming for her, and she wasn't going to stop until Emily was silenced for good. For a long moment, the room was filled with silence, both of them lost in their thoughts. Emily's mind buzzed with fear, anger, and determination. She had spent her entire life living in the shadows, struggling to survive, never imagining that her past held such dark secrets. But now, those secrets were coming to light, and she had no choice but to face them head-on. "I'm not going to run," Emily said, her voice firm. "If Amanda is responsible for my father's death, I need to know the truth, and I need to make sure she pays for what she's done." James nodded, a hint of admiration in his eyes. "We'll do it together, Emily. But we have to be careful. Amanda's dangerous, and she's got people on her side who will do anything to protect her." Emily stood, feeling a surge of strength she hadn't felt in days. She wasn't going to let fear control her anymore, not after everything she had learned. Her father had been taken from her, and now Amanda was threatening to take even more. But Emily wasn't that scared, invisible maid anymore. She was ready to fight. The days that followed James's revelation were a whirlwind. Emily found herself unable to focus on anything else. Her work at the hotel, her daily routines, everything felt insignificant in comparison to the weight of the truth she was slowly uncovering. She couldn't shake the thought that her father's death wasn't the accident she'd always believed. It was a cover-up, a murder disguised as tragedy, and Amanda had a hand in it. But the biggest shock was realizing she had a connection to James Wilson that stretched back decades. She had grown up thinking she was just another faceless person in a sea of ordinary lives, scraping by with no idea that her roots were tied to wealth and power, wealth she had never known existed. James had been distant since their last meeting, sending occasional updates but keeping a low profile. The police investigation was ongoing, and he was working closely with Detective Martinez to build a case against Amanda. But the process was slow and riddled with complications, and each day that passed felt like another day Amanda was getting closer to Emily. As she sat in her new apartment, staring out at the New York skyline, Emily felt the walls closing in on her. The luxury that had once seemed like a dream now felt like a gilded cage, trapping her in a world she barely understood. She was safe here, for now, but she knew it wouldn't last. Amanda had found her once, and she could do it again. The knock on the door startled her out of her thoughts. For a moment, her heart raced, expecting the worst. Amanda's men, or worse, Amanda herself. But when she opened the door, she was greeted by the familiar face of Detective Martinez. His expression was grim, and Emily knew immediately that something had happened. "Can I come in?" he asked, his voice calm but serious. Emily nodded, stepping aside to let him enter. The tension in the room was palpable as Martinez settled into one of the chairs, his eyes scanning the apartment as if making sure they were alone. "We've uncovered more information about your father," Martinez began, his tone measured. "I know this has been difficult for you, but I need you to hear everything. Are you ready for that?" Emily's breath caught in her throat. She wasn't sure she was ready, but she knew she didn't have a choice. She had to face the truth, no matter how painful it might be. "Tell me," she said softly. Martinez pulled out a folder from his briefcase, laying it on the table between them. He opened it to reveal documents, photographs, and police reports, all related to her father. Emily's eyes flicked over the papers, her stomach twisting in knots as the detective began to speak. "Your father, Thomas, wasn't just an ordinary man. He had ties to some powerful people who operated in the shadows, using their wealth and influence to control those around them. One of those people was Amanda's father." Emily's heart sank. She had known Amanda was connected to this, but hearing it out loud made it feel even more real, more terrifying. "What happened to him?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Martinez sighed, flipping through the documents. "Thomas got involved in something he couldn't escape. He was framed for embezzling money from Amanda's father's company, but the truth is, he was set up. He knew too much about their illegal dealings, and they needed a way to get rid of him without raising suspicion." Emily's eyes widened as the detective continued. "The car accident that killed your father was no accident. It was orchestrated by Amanda's family to silence him before he could expose their crimes. He was a threat to them, and they dealt with him in the only way they knew how. The room seemed to close in on Emily as the weight of Martinez's words settled over her. Her father had been murdered, not because of something he had done, but because he had been trying to do the right thing. He had been silenced, just like Amanda was trying to do to her now. Emily swallowed hard, fighting back the tears that threatened to spill. "Why didn't anyone tell me?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Why didn't I know about any of this?" Martinez's expression softened. "Because they made sure you wouldn't find out. After your father's death, they covered their tracks. Your family was left with nothing, no trace of the truth. You and your mother were left to believe it was just a tragic accident." Emily's hands clenched into fists in her lap. The anger, the pain, it all bubbled to the surface at once. She had lived her entire life believing in a lie, and now, the truth was more devastating than she could have ever imagined. "I've been trying to gather more evidence," Martinez continued, "but Amanda's family is powerful. They've covered their tracks well. The only reason we know any of this now is because of what's happening with James. He's digging into the past, and it's bringing up things they thought were long buried." Emily took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "What do I do now? How do we stop her?" Martinez looked at her, his eyes filled with both sympathy and resolve. "We need to find concrete proof, something that ties Amanda directly to your father's death. Without it, she'll keep getting away with everything she's done." Emily's mind raced. She had to find that proof. She couldn't let Amanda get away with this, not after everything she had learned. But how? How could she, an ordinary woman, go up against someone like Amanda? The odds felt overwhelming, but Emily knew she couldn't give up. Not now. "There's something else," Martinez said, breaking the silence. He hesitated for a moment, as if unsure of how to proceed. "James, he's been looking into your past too. He's found out that you're the rightful heir to a portion of your father's estate. Money that was taken from your family when Amanda's father framed him." Emily's eyes widened. "What?" Martinez nodded. "You're not just connected to James through your father's friendship. Legally, you're entitled to a significant amount of money. Money that Amanda's family has kept hidden for years." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Emily had spent her entire life scraping by, working long hours for little pay, never imagining that there was a fortune tied to her name. And now, here it was, dropped in her lap like a bomb. "That's why Amanda is so determined to silence you," Martinez explained. "If you find out the truth, if you claim what's rightfully yours, her entire world falls apart." Emily sat back in her chair, her mind spinning. The puzzle pieces were starting to fit together, but the picture they formed was darker and more dangerous than she had ever imagined. She wasn't just a witness in Amanda's web of lies. She was a threat to everything Amanda had built. "I don't care about the money," Emily said after a long pause. "I just want justice for my father." Martinez nodded, his respect for her clear. "We'll get it. But you need to be careful. Amanda won't stop until she's sure you're no longer a threat." Emily's heart pounded in her chest. She had already been pulled deeper into this world than she ever wanted to be, but now there was no turning back. Amanda had taken everything from her, her father, her family's legacy, and now she was trying to take Emily's life too. But Emily wasn't going to let her. "I'll do whatever it takes," Emily said, her voice steady, her resolve firm. Amanda can't win. Emily spent the next few days in a fog, her mind constantly racing with thoughts of her father, Amanda, and the massive secret she had uncovered about her past. She barely left the apartment, consumed by the weight of what she had learned. Every time her phone buzzed or a shadow crossed the window, her heart would jump, thinking Amanda or Ryan had finally come for her. But she wasn't the same frightened woman from just a week ago. The fear was still there, lingering like a shadow at the edge of her thoughts. But now there was something stronger. Determination. If Amanda thought she could take everything from her, she had another thing coming. Emily wasn't going to let her get away with this. Not now, not ever. On the fourth day, James called. "Emily," his voice was tense, the urgency in his tone unmistakable. "We need to talk. I've found something." Her pulse quickened at the words, and without hesitating, she agreed to meet him. They decided on a quiet cafe on the Upper East Side, far from the chaos of the hotel and the looming shadow of Wilshire Towers. Emily didn't want to risk anyone spotting them together, especially Amanda. The last thing they needed was to tip her off that they were working together. When she arrived at the cafe, James was already there, sitting at a small table in the corner. He looked tired, the weight of their situation etched into the lines of his face. His normally polished, controlled demeanor had given way to something more raw, more vulnerable. "Thanks for coming," he said as she sat down across from him. "Of course," Emily replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "What did you find?" James leaned in, lowering his voice. "I've been digging into Amanda's father's records. There's more going on here than we thought. It's not just about your father. This goes way deeper. There's evidence that Amanda's family has been involved in illegal business deals for years, some of which directly led to the collapse of several companies, including the one your father worked for." Emily felt a chill run down her spine. "What does that mean? How does this connect to my father's death?" James hesitated for a moment before continuing. "Your father wasn't just framed for embezzlement. He was going to blow the whistle on Amanda's family, expose everything. They couldn't let that happen, so they set him up to take the fall. And when they realized he wasn't going to go quietly, they made sure he didn't have the chance to talk." Emily's breath caught in her throat. Her father had been trying to do the right thing. He had been trying to stop Amanda's family, to protect people from their corruption, and they had killed him for it. The realization was like a punch to the gut, the pain of it almost too much to bear. "I can't believe this," Emily whispered, her hands trembling. "All this time, I thought he was just another victim of a random accident." James reached across the table, placing his hand over hers. "I know this is a lot to take in, but you need to understand, Emily, they're not going to stop. Amanda will do whatever it takes to protect her family's secrets, and now that she knows you're a threat, she won't hesitate to come after you." Emily nodded, trying to steady herself. She had known this was dangerous, but hearing it laid out so plainly made it all feel much more real. Amanda wasn't just trying to silence her. She was trying to protect a legacy of corruption and deceit, one that had cost her father his life. And now, Emily was standing in the way of that. "I'm not going to let her win," Emily said, her voice firm. "I don't care what it takes. She can't get away with this." James squeezed her hand, his expression filled with admiration. "You're stronger than you know, Emily. But we need to be smart about this. We don't have enough evidence yet to take her down. We need something concrete, something that ties her directly to your father's death and the illegal activities." Emily's mind raced as she thought about what he was saying. What about Ryan? He's involved too. If we can get him to turn on Amanda, maybe he'll tell us what we need to know. James nodded. "I've thought about that. Ryan's loyalty to Amanda is questionable at best. He's in this for the money, not for her. If we can make him believe that siding with us is his best option, he might be willing to talk." Emily felt a surge of hope. It was a risky plan, but it was the best shot they had. "How do we get to him?" James leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "I've been keeping tabs on him. He frequents a bar downtown, a place Amanda would never set foot in. It's low-key, out of the way. I think it's where he goes to unwind, away from the scrutiny of Amanda's world." Emily's heart pounded in her chest. The idea of confronting Ryan terrified her. But if they could get him to crack, it could be the break they needed. "We need to move fast," she said. "Amanda's already on to me. She called me the other day, threatening me." James's eyes widened in alarm. "She called you. What did she say?" "She said I made a big mistake," Emily replied, her voice shaking slightly. "That people like me don't mess with people like her and get away with it." James's jaw tightened, anger flashing in his eyes. "She's not going to get away with this. We'll make sure of that." Emily nodded, feeling the resolve settle deeper in her chest. They had to move quickly, before Amanda tightened her grip on the situation. Every second counted now, and they couldn't afford to waste any time. They finished their meeting quickly, agreeing to meet at the bar where Ryan frequented later that night. As Emily walked out of the cafe, she couldn't help but feel a mix of fear and determination. This was it, the moment they had been working toward. If they could get Ryan to talk, they could finally bring Amanda down. But if they failed, the consequences didn't bear thinking about. That evening, Emily met James outside the bar, her nerves on edge. The neon lights flickered overhead, casting a dull glow over the cracked sidewalk. The bar wasn't anything special, the kind of place that blended into the background of New York's sprawling nightlife scene. But tonight, it felt like the center of the universe. "You ready for this?" James asked, his voice steady but tense. Emily nodded, though her stomach was in knots. "As ready as I'll ever be." They entered the bar together, the dim lighting and low murmur of voices immediately enveloping them. The smell of stale beer and cigarette smoke hung in the air, a sharp contrast to the clean, polished environments they were used to. It felt dangerous in a way, but that only seemed fitting. Ryan was there, just as James had predicted, sitting alone at the far end of the bar. He didn't notice them at first. His attention focused on the drink in front of him. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as she and James made their way toward him. When they reached him, James spoke first. "Ryan." Ryan looked up, surprise flashing in his eyes. For a moment, he looked like he might bolt, but James quickly took the seat next to him, blocking any potential escape. "We need to talk," James said, his voice low and firm. Ryan glanced between them, suspicion flickering across his face. "What's this about?" Emily leaned forward, her voice steady despite the nerves twisting in her stomach. "It's about Amanda. We know everything." Ryan's eyes narrowed, but there was a flicker of something, fear, uncertainty, in his expression. He didn't respond, waiting for them to continue. "You're in deep, Ryan," James said, his tone cutting through the tension. "But it doesn't have to end badly for you. If you cooperate with us, we can protect you. But you need to help us bring Amanda down." Ryan's jaw clenched, his eyes darting around the room. Emily could see the internal struggle playing out in his mind. He wasn't loyal to Amanda, not really. He was loyal to the money, the lifestyle. And if he thought his safety was in jeopardy, there was a good chance he'd flip. "You don't know what she's capable of," Ryan muttered, his voice low. Emily leaned in closer, her voice soft but insistent. "I know she killed my father. I know she'll do anything to protect herself. But you don't have to go down with her, Ryan. You can walk away from this." For a long moment, Ryan didn't say anything. The silence stretched between them, heavy with tension. But finally, he sighed, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "All right," he said quietly. "I'll tell you what you need to know." Ryan's confession was quiet, almost subdued, but the impact of his words hit Emily and James like a tidal wave. Sitting there, in the dim, smoky bar, with the hum of conversations around them, Emily could hardly believe what she was hearing. The full extent of Amanda's crimes was deeper, more insidious than even she had imagined. Ryan leaned back in his chair, his eyes darting nervously around the room as if Amanda might appear at any moment. "You don't get it," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "Amanda doesn't just protect herself, she erases problems. People who cross her, they don't just disappear. They're destroyed." Emily swallowed hard, trying to steady herself. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ryan sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "She's ruthless. Her father taught her everything. They've been running scams, frauds, backdoor deals for years, all under the radar. And when someone threatens to expose them, they make sure that person isn't around to cause trouble. Your father, he wasn't the first." James clenched his jaw, the anger in his eyes palpable. "And you were okay with that?" he asked, his voice low and controlled. "You were okay with helping her cover up murder?" Ryan flinched, guilt flashing across his face. I didn't know how far it went at first. I thought it was just about the money. But once I was in, there was no way out. Amanda made sure of that. Emily stared at Ryan, feeling a sickening mixture of anger and pity. He was weak, but at least he was talking now. She couldn't let her emotions cloud the mission. "You need to give us something we can use against her," she said, her voice firm. "Something solid, something that ties her directly to my father's death." Ryan nodded, glancing around the bar again. "There are files," he said after a moment. "Amanda's kept records of everything. It's how she controls people, blackmail, leverage. If you get those files, you can bury her." "Where are they?" James asked, leaning in closer. Ryan hesitated, then lowered his voice even further. "She keeps them in a safe at her family's estate upstate. No one goes there anymore except her. The place is practically abandoned, but she still uses it to hide anything she doesn't want anyone finding." Emily felt a surge of hope. This was the break they needed. If they could get their hands on those files, they'd have everything they needed to take Amanda down, for her father's death, for the fraud, for everything. "Can you get us in?" James asked. Ryan shook his head quickly. "No way. If she even suspects I'm involved, I'm dead. But the estate isn't heavily guarded. Amanda thinks no one knows about it. If you're careful, you could get in without anyone noticing." James nodded, already thinking through the logistics. "We'll handle it, but you need to stay out of sight. If Amanda finds out you flipped, she'll come after you too." Ryan didn't argue. He looked like a man on the edge, barely holding it together. Emily wondered if, deep down, he regretted ever getting involved with Amanda in the first place. But now wasn't the time for sympathy. They had a mission. After leaving the bar, Emily and James walked down the street in silence, the cool night air sharp against their skin. The enormity of what they were about to do hung between them like a storm cloud. Breaking into Amanda's family estate was dangerous. If they were caught, there was no telling what Amanda might do. But it was the only way to end this. "We have to be smart about this," James said after a while, breaking the silence. "If we go in unprepared, we're done." Emily nodded, though her nerves were frayed. "I know, but we can't wait. The longer we wait, the more time Amanda has to figure out we're onto her. We need to act fast." James stopped walking, turning to face her. His eyes were intense, filled with both concern and determination. "Emily, I don't want you anywhere near that estate. It's too dangerous." Emily bristled at his words, shaking her head. "I'm not staying behind, James. This is about my father. I deserve to be there." James opened his mouth to protest, but one look at her face, and he knew it was no use. Emily wasn't backing down. She had come too far, learned too much, and she wasn't about to sit on the sidelines now. "All right," he said finally, "but we do this carefully. No risks. If anything feels off, we pull back." Emily nodded, though she knew deep down that pulling back wasn't an option. Not for her. Not when they were so close to getting the justice her father deserved. The drive to Amanda's family estate the next evening was tense, the silence between Emily and James thick with anticipation. The estate was far from the city, nestled in the quiet, sprawling hills of upstate New York. The sun had already dipped below the horizon by the time they pulled up to the long, winding driveway, the shadow of the massive estate looming in the distance. The estate was exactly how Ryan had described it, abandoned but still intimidating. The old mansion sat at the end of the driveway, its tall iron gate slightly ajar as if no one had cared to properly lock them. Overgrown vines snaked their way up the stone walls, and the windows were dark, giving the place an eerie, forgotten feel. James parked the car a safe distance from the gates, killing the engine as they sat in the dark, watching for any signs of movement. But the estate was quiet. No guards, no cameras that they could see. "Are you ready?" James asked, his voice low. Emily nodded, though her heart was pounding. "Let's do this." They slipped out of the car, keeping low as they made their way toward the gates. The air was crisp, the night still, and every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig set Emily on edge. Her breath was shallow, her nerves tingling with adrenaline, but she kept moving forward. She had to. The gates creaked slightly as they pushed them open, but the sound was swallowed by the vastness of the estate. The mansion loomed ahead, its darkened windows like empty eyes watching them approach. Emily couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, even though the place seemed deserted. Once inside the gates, they moved quickly, sticking close to the shadows as they approached the back of the mansion. Ryan had given them detailed instructions on where to find the safe. It was hidden in a small study on the second floor, behind a panel in the wall. Getting to it wouldn't be easy, but it was their only shot. They entered the mansion through a side door that had been left unlocked, the old hinges groaning in protest as they slipped inside. The interior was just as eerie as the outside, dark, cold, and silent. Dust coated the furniture, and the faint smell of mildew lingered in the air. It was clear no one had been here in a long time. Emily's heart raced as they made their way through the hallways, the floor creaking under their feet. Every shadow seemed to move. Every gust of wind through the cracked windows felt like a whisper of warning. But they pressed on, moving deeper into the mansion, toward the study. When they finally reached the study, James quickly set to work, searching for the hidden panel Ryan had described. Emily stood by the door, her nerves on high alert as she listened for any signs of movement. Her pulse thundered in her ears, each second feeling like an eternity. "There," James whispered, his fingers finding the hidden latch. The panel slid open with a soft click, revealing a small, steel safe embedded in the wall. Emily's heart leapt. This was it. The files that could bring Amanda down. But just as James started working on the safe, the faint sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway. Emily froze, her blood turning to ice. Someone was here. "James," she whispered urgently, her eyes wide with fear. "Someone's coming." James cursed under his breath, his hands working faster to crack the safe. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as the footsteps grew louder, closer. They were running out of time. Finally, with a soft click, the safe door swung open. James grabbed the files inside, stuffing them into his bag just as the footsteps stopped outside the study door. "We need to go," Emily hissed, her voice barely audible. But before they could move, the door creaked open, and Emily's worst fear was realized. Amanda stood in the doorway, her eyes cold and calculating, a cruel smile curling on her lips. Well, she said, her voice dripping with venom. "Looks like the little maid finally learned how to play." Emily's breath caught in her throat as Amanda's cold eyes bore into her. The smug, cruel smile on Amanda's face sent chills down her spine. The room felt like it had shrunk, every shadow looming, every exit blocked. Emily had been preparing herself for this moment, but nothing could have readied her for the reality of facing Amanda like this. Alone in the darkened mansion, no one around to help. James stood frozen by the safe, the files clutched in his hands. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. It was clear Amanda had expected this, maybe even planned it. She always seemed to be a step ahead. "Well, I have to say, I'm impressed," Amanda continued, her voice slick and smooth as she stepped further into the room. "I knew you were getting bold, Emily, but I didn't think you had it in you to break into my family's estate." Emily's pulse raced. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but there was no way out. Amanda blocked the door, and behind her, a shadow moved, Ryan, lurking just out of sight. He had betrayed them. Of course he had. The moment they'd left the bar, he must have gone straight to Amanda. James took a step forward, his face a mask of barely controlled anger. "This ends here, Amanda. We have the evidence. Your lies, your crimes, they're all coming out." Amanda let out a low, mocking laugh. "Oh, James," she purred, shaking her head slightly. "You always did have such a naive view of the world. Do you really think a few old papers are enough to stop me? I've been playing this game for years. You think I'm going to let a couple of nobodies like you take me down?" Emily's hands balled into fists at her sides. "You killed my father," she said, her voice steady but laced with fury. "And now you're going to pay for it." Amanda's smile faltered for a brief moment, a flash of something dark and dangerous crossing her face. "Your father was a fool," she spat, her tone suddenly sharp. "He thought he could outsmart my family. He thought he could expose us, take us down. But we handled him, just like I'm going to handle you." Before either Emily or James could react, Amanda snapped her fingers, and Ryan stepped into the room, his expression cold, his eyes filled with regret. In his hand was a gun. Emily's heart dropped. "I didn't want it to come to this," Ryan muttered, his voice low, as if he were apologizing. "But Amanda, she doesn't leave loose ends." James tensed beside Emily, his eyes darting between Ryan and Amanda. He wasn't stupid. He knew this was about survival now. "You don't have to do this, Ryan," James said, his voice calm, steady. "You can walk away from this. We can protect you." Ryan's gaze flicked toward Amanda, uncertainty crossing his features. For a split second, Emily saw the hesitation in his eyes. He wasn't a killer, not really. He was just as trapped as they were. But Amanda stepped closer to him, her voice dripping with venom. "Ryan, if you don't take care of this, I will. And believe me, it'll be a lot messier if I do." Ryan's grip on the gun tightened, his jaw clenching. Emily's breath was shallow, her mind racing, trying to think of something, anything, that could get them out of this alive. She knew Ryan wasn't loyal to Amanda. He was just scared, and scared people made mistakes. "Ryan," Emily said softly, taking a small step forward, her hands raised slightly in a gesture of peace. "You don't have to do this. She's using you. If you go through with this, you'll never be free of her." Amanda's eyes narrowed dangerously, but Emily pressed on, her voice firm and steady. "If you pull that trigger, your life will always belong to her. But if you help us, you can walk away. You can start over." For a long moment, the room was silent. The only sound, the pounding of Emily's heart in her ears. Ryan's gaze flicked between Emily and Amanda, torn between his fear of Amanda and the possibility of escape. Amanda, sensing his hesitation, stepped closer to him, her voice low and dangerous. "Ryan, don't be stupid. You know what I'll do to you if you don't handle this." Ryan's hand wavered, the gun shaking slightly. Emily held her breath, praying that he would make the right choice. She could see the war playing out in his mind, the fear, the uncertainty. But then, something shifted in his expression. His eyes softened, his grip on the gun loosening just slightly. "I'm sorry," Ryan whispered, lowering the gun. Amanda's eyes flared with fury. "You coward!" she hissed, lunging toward him, but James was faster. He stepped between Amanda and Ryan, grabbing Amanda's arm and twisting it behind her back with a swift, controlled motion. She let out a furious scream, but James held her firmly, his grip unyielding. "Ryan, get the gun," James barked, and Ryan quickly bent down, retrieving the weapon from the floor where he had dropped it. Emily's pulse was racing, adrenaline flooding her veins. They had Amanda. They had the files. They had everything they needed to end this nightmare once and for all. But as they began to secure Amanda, something else clicked into place in Emily's mind. This wasn't just about taking Amanda down. This was about justice for her father, for the years she had lost, for the life that had been stolen from her. Amanda struggled in James's grip, her face twisted in fury. "You think this is over?" she spat, her voice filled with venom. "You think you've won?" James's eyes were cold as he tightened his hold on her. "It's over, Amanda." But Amanda's smile returned, slow and dangerous. "You're a fool, James. You've always been a fool. You really think I don't have a plan for this?" Emily's heart sank as Amanda's words hit her like a slap to the face. Of course Amanda had a plan. She always did. She wasn't the type to go down without a fight. Suddenly, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the mansion, and Emily's stomach turned. More of Amanda's people. They were out of time. "We need to get out of here, now," Ryan said urgently, his voice shaking. James nodded, pulling Amanda toward the door, but Emily could feel the panic rising in her chest. They had the evidence, but they still had to get out alive. Amanda's men were closing in, and they were trapped inside the mansion. As they hurried down the hallway, Amanda's laughter echoed behind them, chilling and full of malice. "You're all dead," she sneered. "You don't even realize it yet." But Emily wasn't ready to give up. Not now, not when they were so close. She had fought too hard to let Amanda win. They had to make it out. They had to. As they reached the front door, the sounds of footsteps grew louder. James glanced at Emily, his eyes filled with determination. "Stay close," he said. "We're going to make it." Emily nodded, her pulse pounding in her ears. She couldn't afford to be afraid now, not when everything was on the line. With one final glance back at the dark, looming mansion, they burst through the front door, the cool night air hitting them like a shock to the system. But they weren't safe yet. A group of men, Amanda's hired thugs, appeared at the far end of the driveway, guns in hand, their eyes locked on Emily, James, and Ryan. "We have to run," Emily gasped, her legs already burning with the effort. James nodded, his grip tightening on Amanda as they sprinted toward the car. The men shouted after them, but they didn't stop. They couldn't stop. Just as they reached the car, gunfire rang out, the deafening cracks splitting the air around them. Emily ducked instinctively, her heart racing as she threw herself into the passenger seat. James shoved Amanda into the back seat, slamming the door behind her as bullets pinged off the car's metal frame. "Go! Go! Go!" James shouted as Ryan floored the gas pedal. The car lurched forward, speeding down the long driveway, away from the estate, away from the danger. Emily's breath came in shallow gasps as she glanced back at the mansion disappearing behind them, the men still firing into the darkness. They had escaped, but just barely. Amanda sat in the back seat, her wrists bound with a piece of rope James had found in the car. Her eyes were still full of fury, her lips twisted into a sneer. But Emily didn't care. They had her now. They had everything. "We did it," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible over the roar of the engine. James nodded, his eyes focused on the road ahead. "It's over, Emily. We've got her." But as they sped away into the night, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't quite over yet. Amanda's words echoed in her mind, her chilling laughter still ringing in her ears. "You're all dead. You don't even realize it yet." The car roared down the dark highway, the hum of the tires against the asphalt barely cutting through the tension inside. Amanda sat in the back, her wrists bound, her eyes burning holes into the back of Emily's head. The silence between them was deafening, punctuated only by the faint sound of breathing and the engine's steady rhythm. Emily couldn't relax. The adrenaline was still pumping through her veins. And though they had escaped the estate, it didn't feel like victory yet. Amanda's presence in the car was a reminder that, even though they had her now, the danger wasn't over. They still had to get the files to the police. They still had to ensure Amanda faced justice for everything she had done. Ryan, who had been silent since they fled the estate, finally spoke up from the driver's seat. "What now?" His voice was tight with fear and uncertainty. James leaned forward, his eyes hard with determination. "We take Amanda and these files to Detective Martinez. We have everything we need to bring her down now." Amanda's laugh cut through the air like a knife, sharp and mocking. "You really think this is over?" she sneered, her voice dripping with venom. "You're playing a game you don't understand, James. My family has been at this for years. You think a few documents are enough to take us down. You're delusional." James shot her a cold look in the rearview mirror. "You're done, Amanda. This time, you don't get to talk your way out of it." Amanda leaned back against the seat, her smile dark and unsettling. "We'll see about that." Emily couldn't help but feel a knot tighten in her stomach at Amanda's words. Even in defeat, Amanda exuded a dangerous confidence. There was something unnerving about it, as if she had one more card to play that none of them saw coming. Emily glanced at James, his jaw set in grim determination, and then at Ryan, who kept his eyes glued to the road, clearly trying to keep himself out of the confrontation brewing in the car. The hours seemed to stretch as they drove back toward the city. Emily's nerves frayed with each passing mile. She kept thinking about her father, about everything Amanda's family had taken from her. And now, after all these years, the truth was finally within reach. But there was no denying the risk. Amanda's family was powerful, and they wouldn't let this go quietly. As they neared the city, the streetlights cast long shadows across the highway, and Emily's phone buzzed in her lap. It was Detective Martinez. She answered quickly, her voice shaky but urgent. "Detective, it's Emily. We've got her. We have Amanda, and we've got the files." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then Martinez's voice came through, steady and calm. "Good work, Emily. Where are you?" "We're about 20 minutes outside the city," Emily replied. "We're heading to the station now." Martinez's tone shifted, a hint of urgency creeping in. "Don't go to the station. Take her to a secure location. We'll meet you there." Emily frowned, her heart skipping a beat. "Why? What's going on?" Martinez hesitated for a second, then said, "Amanda's family has powerful connections. Emily, we've already had a few leaks within the department. We can't risk bringing her in through the front door. Just trust me. Take her to the warehouse on 8th Avenue. It's safe. I'll have officers waiting there." Emily exchanged a quick glance with James, who had been listening to the conversation. He gave a slight nod, indicating they should follow Martinez's instructions. "Okay," Emily said into the phone. "We'll head to the warehouse." As she hung up, she noticed Amanda's smile widen ever so slightly, as if she knew something they didn't. It sent a chill down Emily's spine. But they had no choice. They had to trust Martinez. Ryan took a sharp turn off the highway, heading toward the city's industrial district. The streets grew quieter, darker, as they approached the warehouse district. It was an area Emily didn't know well, mostly abandoned buildings and factories that had long since fallen into disrepair. The warehouse loomed ahead, a massive, shadowy structure at the end of a narrow street. As they pulled up to the entrance, Emily's nerves spiked. Everything about this situation felt wrong. There were no police cars, no officers waiting to meet them, just the cold, empty lot in front of the warehouse. "We're here," Ryan muttered, killing the engine. The car sat in silence for a moment as they all stared at the building. James was the first to speak. "Stay sharp," he said, his voice low. "Something feels off." They got out of the car cautiously, Amanda's eyes following their every move with that unsettling smile still plastered on her face. Emily's heart raced as they approached the warehouse door, every instinct screaming at her to turn back. But it was too late now. They were in too deep. As they stepped inside, the sound of their footsteps echoed in the vast, empty space. The warehouse was dimly lit, with only a few flickering bulbs hanging from the ceiling, casting eerie shadows across the floor. Emily's pulse quickened as she glanced around. It was too quiet. Suddenly, the door behind them slammed shut with a deafening bang. Emily spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. 3 men stood at the entrance, guns drawn, their faces cold and expressionless. She recognized them immediately. They were Amanda's men, the same ones from the estate. Amanda let out a soft, satisfied laugh. "I told you," she said, her voice cutting through the silence. "You don't understand the game." James's jaw clenched, his eyes narrowing as he stepped in front of Emily protectively. "What is this?" he demanded. Amanda shrugged casually, as if this were all part of some grand, inevitable plan. "This is the part where you lose, James." One of the men stepped forward, his gun aimed squarely at James. "Hand over the files," he ordered, his voice cold and mechanical. Emily's mind raced. They were trapped. There was no way out. She could feel the panic rising in her chest, but she fought to stay calm. She had come too far to let Amanda win now. James, ever composed, tightened his grip on the bag containing the files. "You're not getting these," he said, his voice steady but firm. The man cocked his gun, the sound sending a shiver down Emily's spine. "I won't ask again." For a moment, everything seemed to hang in the balance, the tension so thick it was almost suffocating. Emily's pulse pounded in her ears as she waited for something, anything, to break the standoff. And then, out of the shadows, a voice cut through the silence. "Lower your weapons." Emily whipped around, her heart leaping into her throat. It was Martinez, flanked by several officers, their guns drawn and trained on Amanda's men. Relief flooded through her, but the situation was still precarious. Martinez stepped forward, his eyes locked on Amanda. "It's over," he said calmly. "You're done." Amanda's smile faltered, just for a second, but it was enough to give Emily hope. Martinez's officers moved swiftly, disarming Amanda's men and securing the files. The weight of the past few days suddenly hit Emily all at once, and she felt her knees weaken. But she held firm, watching as Martinez approached Amanda, handcuffs in hand. "You've lost, Amanda," Martinez said as he snapped the cuffs around her wrists. "You're going to pay for everything." Amanda's face twisted in fury, but she said nothing as Martinez led her away. The men who had worked for her were taken into custody, their expressions grim. Emily stood there, numb, as she watched them all being taken away. It was over. After all the lies, the danger, and the fear, Amanda was finally going to face justice. But instead of feeling triumphant, Emily just felt empty. James placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch grounding her in the moment. "You did it," he said softly. "It's over." Emily nodded, though the reality of it all hadn't quite sunk in yet. She had fought for this moment, for her father, for herself, and now it was here. But it felt hollow, like there was still something missing. As the officers finished up, Martinez walked over to Emily, his expression softening. "You did good, Emily," he said. "Your father would be proud." The words hit her harder than she expected, and for the first time in days, she let herself feel the weight of it all. Tears welled up in her eyes, but they weren't just tears of sadness. They were tears of relief, of closure. Her father's legacy had finally been vindicated. Amanda was going to pay for what she had done, and Emily could finally begin to move on. But as she wiped the tears from her eyes and looked out at the darkened city beyond the warehouse, she couldn't help but wonder what her life would be like now. The fight was over, but a new chapter was about to begin. The following days passed in a blur. News of Amanda's arrest spread quickly through the city's gossip columns, but the headlines only scratched the surface of the tangled web of corruption, fraud, and murder that Emily had uncovered. It was strange to see her own life splashed across the papers, a story that had once been her private nightmare now fodder for the public. But Amanda was in custody, and Ryan had turned state's witness in exchange for leniency. The files James and Emily had retrieved from the estate were more than enough to bury Amanda and her family's criminal empire. Detective Martinez assured her it was only a matter of time before Amanda was formally charged with murder, conspiracy, and a laundry list of other crimes. Emily felt a sense of relief, but there was still a lingering hollowness inside her, a feeling that something was unfinished. She had spent so long fighting, searching for justice, that she hadn't stopped to think about what came next. Now that the battle was over, she was left with her thoughts, her memories, and the uncertainty of a future she hadn't planned for. She sat in her new apartment, gazing out at the city skyline. The sunset bathed the buildings in a warm, golden light, but Emily felt a strange disconnect. The luxury that had once seemed like a dream felt more like a reminder of how much her life had changed. She had inherited a fortune, her father's name was cleared, and Amanda was going to pay for her crimes. But what did that mean for Emily? There was a knock at the door, pulling her out of her thoughts. When she opened it, she found James standing there, a soft smile on his face. "Mind if I come in?" he asked. Emily stepped aside, letting him in. He walked over to the window, his eyes scanning the city below before turning back to her. "How are you holding up?" he asked gently, his voice full of concern. Emily shrugged, sitting down on the couch. "I don't know," she admitted. "I should feel happy, I guess. But I don't know if I do." James sat beside her, his presence comforting. "It makes sense," he said. "You've spent so long fighting for justice. Now that it's over, it's hard to know what comes next." Emily nodded. "Yeah, that's exactly it. I've been so focused on the past, on what Amanda did to my father, on uncovering the truth, that I never thought about the future. And now that it's here, I don't know what to do." James was silent for a moment. Then he turned to her, his expression thoughtful. "You've been through a lot, Emily. More than most people could ever imagine. It's going to take time to figure out what you want. But you have a clean slate now. You can start over, do anything you want." Emily sighed, leaning back against the couch. "That's the thing. I don't know what I want. I've spent my whole life just trying to survive. And now I have all these opportunities. But I feel lost." James leaned forward, his eyes softening. "You're not lost. You're just free, for the first time in a long time." Emily looked at him, feeling the weight of his words. He was right. She was free. Free from the burden of the past, free from the secrets and lies that had weighed her down for so long. She had the chance to start over, to build a life on her own terms. But what kind of life did she want? "I guess I'm just scared," Emily admitted. "I'm not used to having choices." James nodded, understanding in his eyes. "It's okay to be scared. But you've already proven how strong you are, Emily. You took down Amanda. You uncovered the truth about your father. You can handle whatever comes next." Emily smiled faintly. "I couldn't have done it without you." James shrugged, a playful smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Maybe, but you're the one who made the decision to step up, to take control. You saved my life, remember? And you didn't back down when things got tough." Emily's smile grew, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she felt a flicker of hope. Maybe she didn't have all the answers yet, but she had her life back. She had choices, and she wasn't alone. James had become more than just an ally in this fight. He had become someone she could rely on, someone who had seen her at her worst and still stood by her side. As if reading her thoughts, James spoke again. "You don't have to figure it all out right now. Take it one day at a time. And if you ever need anything, well, you know where to find me." Emily laughed softly. "I might take you up on that." They sat in companionable silence for a few moments, watching as the city lights began to twinkle against the fading light of the sunset. The weight that had been pressing down on Emily's chest slowly began to lift. It wasn't gone completely, but it was lighter now, more manageable. Eventually, James stood to leave, giving her a reassuring smile before heading to the door. "Take care of yourself, Emily. You've earned it." Emily nodded, watching him go. As the door clicked shut behind him, she felt a strange sense of peace settle over her. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid of it. She had faced worse and come out the other side. Whatever happened next, she knew she could handle it. In the weeks that followed, the legal process moved quickly. Amanda's trial began, and with the overwhelming evidence stacked against her, it didn't take long for the jury to reach a verdict: guilty on all counts. Watching Amanda's face as the sentence was read, Emily felt a sense of closure she hadn't expected. Amanda's downfall was complete. Her power, her wealth, her legacy, it was all gone. Ryan's cooperation had helped bring the entire operation to light, and though he wasn't innocent, his testimony earned him a reduced sentence. Emily wasn't sure how to feel about Ryan. He had been complicit in so many of Amanda's crimes, but in the end, he had chosen to do the right thing. It wasn't redemption, but it was something. With Amanda behind bars and her family's empire dismantled, Emily's life slowly returned to some semblance of normalcy. She moved out of the luxurious apartment James had given her and found a place of her own, a modest but comfortable home where she could finally start fresh. She wasn't interested in living the high life, in being surrounded by wealth and power. That wasn't who she was. Instead, she focused on rebuilding her life from the ground up. She found a new job, one that allowed her to use the skills she had developed over the years. She reconnected with the friends she had lost touch with, and she began to heal from the trauma of her past. It wasn't easy, but it was real. It was hers. One evening, as she sat on her balcony watching the sunset, Emily found herself thinking about her father. She wondered what he would say if he could see her now, if he would be proud of the woman she had become. She liked to think he would be. She had fought for him, for his memory, and for her own sense of justice. And in the end, she had won. She took a deep breath, letting the cool evening air wash over her. The city below was alive with possibility, and for the first time in a long time, Emily felt at peace. She didn't have all the answers, but she had her life back, and that was enough.